Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, we're going to be covering something I'm super excited about. This is going to be really fun for me. I am calling it, as of right now anyway, the ecology of morality. Because to me, that's very exciting. I know it's not going to be very exciting for most people, so by the time that this goes out tomorrow, I will definitely have a better name, so people will actually click on it and listen to it, because we're going to be talking about some really interesting stuff. What we're going to be talking about is how our morality, as in what is the best way to behave, how morality is prescribed to us, essentially. How morality is prescribed to us by the environment in which we exist and the environment in which our ancestors existed. We're going to be doing this through the lens of game theory. If you don't know what game theory is, I'll discuss that briefly. It's not really that important. It's just the lens that we'll be using. We're going to talk about like the best strategies in nature, what goes wrong with those strategies, by calling that signal errors. We're going to talk about how in the world, with all of this like stuff, that an honest culture can actually get a foothold in the world, because that's kind of hard to figure out at first. We're going to be talking about like the dopamine circuits and how that's involved in morality and what it is that we do and want to do and how we respond to things. We're going to be talking about neurological maybes and almosts and how powerful that is, and of course what the biochemical analogs are to all of these things. And I'm going to be tying it, as I always try to do, to our narrative, to trauma, and to the narrative of our cultures. So a lot of this is going to reference back to one of my favorite books in the world, Ishmael. Even though Ishmael is not what inspired this podcast, it has so much to do with it, because I'm going to be trying to tie this to what our general dominant culture's version of this crap is, which for me, Christianity, growing up in the Midwest. So we're going to be talking about all kinds of crap, and that's what makes me so happy, is putting together all of these pieces. So without any further ado, let's get started. So the first thing to talk about is, what is game theory? Game theory is a theoretical framework for conceiving social situations among competing players. Basically, it's putting on a sociological lens. It's thinking about like using a framework to understand how people are going to behave, especially in competition. And since the resources are fairly limited in a very general way, we're kind of always competing. So that's what game theory is. And it sounds kind of silly, but it's actually very, very important and very powerful, because this is the realm of politicians and warlords and god emperors or whatever. Like the Chinese had god emperors, lots of places. So did the Egyptians, like god emperors. Anyway, the types of people who are responsible for large numbers of other people, the way that they view the world is essentially through a lens of game theory. And with this whole thing of ecology determining morality, I find it incredibly interesting. And this as a podcast was stimulated for me by an interview I just saw with two people that I just love hearing them. One, Dr. Sapolsky. You know, Sapolsky is bae. When it comes to behavioral biology, he's bae. He's amazing. I love everything about him. There is one thing that we disagree on, and it's on free will, which is his new book, Determined, is all about the science of a world with no free will. It's so good, but that's not what we're here for today. The other person is controversial, and that's his name is Jordan Peterson. And most people just know him as a misogynist, but I found Jordan Peterson when I first started writing Rethinking Broken, and I was in Costa Rica, and I had never heard of any of the other stuff. I just listened to him for hours because he is so clear in what he is saying and what he is trying to say. His ability to communicate accurately and with clarity is incredible. I don't have the same outcomes that he does because we have different suppositions, or presuppositions rather, and because of those differences in our original suppositions, we have slightly different outcomes. But the process that he outlines in his mind is always phenomenal. So as soon as I saw the two of them having a conversation, I was super excited. And it was like a 2-hour conversation. So I'm really excited to get into this because those two stimulate me very, very much. And I want to translate some of that stimulation to you. So to lay it out, Jordan Peterson is always looking at things from a mythology perspective in a lot of cases. He does a lot of biblical stuff. And that's where I think that's where things tie to Ishmael for me, the book Ishmael. And Sapolsky is a primatologist. So one of the last things I'll share with you is an incredible story that he has from baboons that he studied and the neighboring troop of baboons. There was some really interesting stuff there that caused a real rarity in the ecosystem of baboons, where there were more females than males in a troop, like twice as many females as males in a troop. So things got very interesting. But this episode is all about the ecology of morality, or how does environment shape the way in which we ought to behave. So the standard for game theory is the prisoner's dilemma. Do you push somebody in front of a train to save 5 other people? And that's the question, right? You're put between a rock and a hard place. And what Sapolsky brought up is a study that was done that he put in Behave that I've always thought was very interesting. When they were looking into this, it was the 70s, and they decided to just ask all of their really smart friends and ask all kinds of people, from like prize fighters to like Nobel Peace Prize winners to like your granny. And they asked everybody, what would your strategy be if you're going to play this game? What strategy would you employ? And they took all those strategies, and then they ran them through one of those 70s computers that just did thousands upon thousands of iterations of the same game. And it turns out that of all of the strategies that a person could have, of like cooperating and then not cooperating, or cooperating and then not cooperating, or just don't cooperate at all because then you win, of all of those strategies, one actually won out hands down above all of the others. The phrase that they use is it competed the other strategies into extinction. And that strategy was tit for tat. Meaning, we start off, I trust you, you trust me, and I only cheat you after you have cheated me. And that's actually, it's incredible how simple that it is, but it works across the species. And so we're not really getting to a place where we can extrapolate quite yet, but we will soon. There's an issue, though, because there's 2 things that are important about this. Number one, in game theory, the automatic assumption that is always relevant and in game theory is iterative games, meaning you are repeatedly playing the same games with the same people, or playing multiple different games with the same people. But importantly, it is iterative, and the number of games that you are going to play is unknown. Those are 2 presuppositions for game theory. And the reason is because if there's only a one-off, why not cheat immediately? If there's a 2 off, why not? And you know that you might as well cheat on the last one, so you might as well cheat on the first one too. So you'll cheat right there. And you can do the same thing for 3. And so if you know what the strategy is, then if you know how many games you're going to play with this person, then you can kind of manipulate things differently. But the reality for most people, and that's who we're interested in when we're looking at game theory. I mean, that's who I'm interested in when I'm looking at game theory stuff. When you're looking at people, we don't really know how many games we're going to play or what those games are or what the rules are all of the time. We just know that we're probably going to be playing multiple games with multiple people and doing it over an extended period of time. That gives rise to tit for tat, where you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. If you stab me in the back, I'll stab you in the back. And that works, but then there has to enter a new thing here that we call forgiveness. And when do you do that? And the answer, again, is ecological. The answer for when do you forgive is actually determined even in nature by the environment in which you are from or your ancestors are from, because that's what got imprinted into us through our cultures. So when to forgive, it turns out that you don't forgive every time. But after you've been stabbed in the back once and then you stab them in the back, the most successful strategy is to then forgive and say, all right, well, now we're even, forgive and go back to trying to be generous. That works well, right? So cool, awesome. However, then we introduce the concept of signal errors. What if our communication goes wrong and I misunderstand something? It doesn't really matter what the exact thing is. There's always a chance for signal errors. A perfect example of this is with a study that they did with vampire bats. Vampire bats don't actually drink, the adults don't actually drink blood. What happens is they all socially feed. So because hunting, and that's what they're doing, is they're going around and hunting, looking for a cow to suck some blood out and then take it back to their babies and feed the babies. When they go out hunting, it's not always successful. Mama bat might not always find food. So they, as a species, have decided that generosity is going to be built into the species because it is ecological for the species. Meaning, since you don't always get food, it behooves you for the females to go out and get food for their baby in the form of blood. They go out, find a cow, suck up all their blood into these little blood sacs that get engorged, and then they fly back to the babies. And they feed not only their baby, but they feed other babies as well. And hooray, yay, look how generous and kind and sweet all of that is, which is true, but it also has a very important protective factor of hunting is not a promised thing. So if I don't go out and if I go out and I don't find food for my baby, some other lady is going to come and feed my baby, and huzzah, we live to survive another day. This is an example in bat culture of how morality, as far as how generous one should be, is built into the culture through the ecology of how the species survives in general. So now enter the signal error issue. What they did to look at how these behaviors change according with different stimuli is they caught one of these bats on the way out of the cave, and they engorged the bat, but instead of blood, engorged it with air. And then when the mom came back, they're like, look at the mama, she's got all of this blood, look at her, she's so engorged, she will feed all of our babies. And then she feeds none of the babies because she has no blood. Turns out other moms stop feeding her baby. They will stop feeding her baby bats because she failed on their social contract. Now, that's a signal error because she didn't actually fail on their social contract. We caused them to fail for the purpose of this study. But I find this very interesting because this gives us a very loose framework to understand, okay, generosity in the way that we think of it can be a process that is beneficial for the species. And when that social contract is broken, there is a price to pay. And that price in this case was the other mom's not feeding the baby. But in order for this to work or make any sense, we have to recognize that this is happening in a real physical environment. And that's why this is the ecology of morality. This is happening in a real physical environment, which is no longer what our predominant environment is, at least for anybody under the age of 30. Our predominant environment is now virtual. What are the differences and why does it matter? We know physical is different from virtual, but what are the actual things that make a difference? And really what makes a difference is when you have a physical interaction and you have a physical landscape and with which that you are interacting with another person or vampire bat, then you see them. You see them at the water cooler, you see them at the company picnic. In each small interaction, every time you say, "Hey, Bob," each of those little interactions instill a tiny bit of trust. Because at least if you've seen them around and you know them, you can assume that since they haven't caused any problems, they're at least mostly like you, which means you'll get along to some degree, you have some shared culture, they're mostly like you. And that gives them the benefit of the doubt. And so you can give somebody the benefit of a doubt when there is a signal error. In the virtual world, one of the things that's most important in game theory, it's all about repeated iterative interactions. And the reason that that's important is because those iterative interactions and all of the interactions that we have in our physical environment, they all add to our sense of reputation and our reputation preceding us. In a virtual world, you have none of that because you can interact essentially anonymously and you can interact as a one-off. And those are the opposite of what happens with game theory. So game theory, in a way, completely breaks down when you put it into a virtual world because now we're no longer having iterative interactions. We might, but we don't know that because we don't know that the person behind the screen name is actually the same person. If it's a bot, if it's a person pretending to be another person, we don't know. And we know that we can just pop in, say what we want to say, it pop out, and there are no real world implications where if you worked with that person and you did have to see Bob at the cooler the next day, you probably wouldn't have said what you said on Facebook. So virtualization of signal errors is causing catastrophic problems because now these built-in morality guides, because I believe that our morality is essentially chosen for us by our environment and the culture that we inherited from our parents and our ancestors and the environment in which they survived. You lose track of all of that when you dive into this virtual space in which you're not actually you. You don't need to be you. So there is no longer a feedback loop to decide the morality. What I mean by that is there is a feedback loop for the morality in the bat species, right? There is a feedback loop of here's what our culture says. We socially feed. And if you come back all engorged and you don't feed our babies and it looks like you're reneging on that social contract, then we don't help you out. You are punished for breaking the social contract. And the virtualization of the world has virtualized the signal errors, so there is no like trust fund. Like I think Brene Brown talks about what she talked to her kid about, like, what is trust to you, and she's like, it's like a coin jar where you put in a quarter every time that you like have an interaction, they do something nice. That's not happening with everything being virtual. So you can't just give people the benefit of a doubt, because there is no built-in consequence for breaking any kind of social contract. And because we all have different backgrounds, ethnically and culturally, we all have very different, like, moral systems. We have different moral guides because we come from different backgrounds that had different ecologies and different ecosystems, different geographies even. So essentially, the virtualization, when we first started talking about game theory, and we're like, yeah, if there's only 3 or if there's only 2, then you can cheat basically any time. That is essentially what is happening in the virtual space. Is it is breeding psychopathy in the majority of people, or in people who are under socialized. And with the further virtualization of the world, we will have further isolation of people, physical isolation of people, which then they are socially isolated, which means they're then not socially mature. So we feed back into this feedback loop of making more and more psychopaths by them not having interactions with anybody in the real world. So they're not getting what I would just call consequences, bitch. It's just consequences. Yeah, you got the right to say whatever you want, but you got the right to do whatever you want. And the reality is you will pay consequences for that. The problem with the virtual world is we no longer have consequences. So with all of that, how does an honest culture take a toehold then? If we know we're only going to have a handful of interactions, there's no reason to play fair. And if you like, and with the further psychopathy of the world, how does an honest culture get a toehold? And there's basically 2 ways to foster more equanimity. And one is through risking generosity, risking a small amount of generosity, and hoping that is reciprocated. And if it's not reciprocated, hopefully you were smart enough to not leave your single most valuable treasure out for somebody else to give it to them, and then maybe not reciprocate that. Or there is a ecological one. There's many cases of this having happened where, say, there's a land bridge or something, and then that land bridge disappears, and now you have an isolated population. That isolated population is now your quintessential hallmark for game theory, because it is now iterative interactions with the same group of people, the same small group of people, where your reputation becomes everything. And this, I think, is a perfect example. This is a perfect time to bring in all of the Jesus stuff, because I believe that religion is nothing more than a way to pass down culture to the next generation that says this is the best way to be in the world. I think that's at its heart what it originally was intended to be. And so with the cultures that get isolated and then have all of these iterative interactions, your reputation becomes everything. And to bring in all the gospel-y things, this is where you lay up your treasures in heaven. And like, don't leave your treasures around where moths and rust and all of that Bible stuff. But what does that mean? Why? How is that a piece of culture that fosters the survival of a group of people? Well, it's essentially the same as the golden rule, right? It's the golden rule is treat other people the way that you would like to be treated. So treat other people kindly, treat other people well, don't cheat them, that basic sort of stuff. And what that is teaching, in a way, is tit for tat. Additionally, with Abrahamic faiths and things, I've brought this up before, you'll notice that cultures from like rainforest ecologies are almost always polytheistic. And ones from nomadic, middle of nowhere areas are almost always monotheistic, because there is one thing they have to deal with: the sun. And in a rainforest, there is an infinite variety of all kinds of things that they have to interact with and deal with on a regular basis. And they see the interactions of those things. Whereas from a monotheistic culture, there's really only the one thing that you have to worry about, other than if somebody stabs you in the back. So the golden rule there about treat others the way that you would like to be treated, but also if anybody slights you, you better get them back. And this is where you get the honor-based cultures, because this also makes sense from an ecological perspective. If you are an agriculturalist, or if you are even in a rainforest where there is tons of food and shelter, and all the things that you need everywhere, you're not at much risk if somebody takes your banana. You're like, that's not that bad. You can go get a pineapple. You can go get you can go get some mushrooms. You can go eat a lemur, whatever. But there are other options. Whereas in a pastoralist faith, where all the Abrahamic faiths were born from pastoralists all in the Middle East, where all you had was your flock. If somebody came and stole one of your sheep in the middle of the night, you're out there by yourself. You have no clan to be that resource or to be that reciprocation for unjust acts. There is nobody to act on behalf of you except you. Like, there is no feedback loop the way that there is a feedback loop for those bats that says, oh, if you do this, other people will punish you. The feedback loop in this case is you can't steal a farm. Like, you can't steal my whole farm. But if you steal one of my sheep, there's nothing stopping you from coming and stealing the whole flock. So blood for blood. That's the only fair way. And this is that follow-up to the tit for tat. We'll give tit for tat. We'll treat other people the way that we ought to be treated, or the way that we want to be treated, until we are backstabbed. And then we will bloody you to the level of what you did to me, or more so, depending on how arid the climate was. And then we can go back to being friends. Which, oh my God, if this is not the culture that raised me, where I saw my cousins fighting downstairs, fist fight, knocking each other's, blood out of each other's nose, blacking each other's eyes. I'm surprised people didn't lose a tooth. And Uncle Ronnie was like, boys will be boys. Get it over with, get it out of your system, and move on. And they did. And me and my brother did the same thing. You get mad at each other, you beat the hell out of each other, and then you go, okay, well, I feel better now. And you move on, and you go back to the way that things were. Once you get over the fact that one of you was crossed and got mad about it, now you do your reciprocity thing, and you move forward. I find it so interesting that these parallels that are taught in religion are so well understood as ecological principles. And so from a biology perspective, really what we're talking about here is what these religions were trying to do, I think, is they were trying to instill a sense of morality as to what is your long-term best survival. And when God gave Abraham his covenant and said, if you do these things and live by these rules, then your ancestors will outlive everyone else. I think what they were literally saying is, we have laid out tit for tat for you, along with precautions for signal errors. And if you follow this, then you will still definitely struggle for I think it was 4 generations or something, I'm not sure. But if you'll still struggle for X number of generations, but then you will take over after that. Which is exactly what the computer analogy said in the 1970s when they ran all of those strategies for the prisoner's dilemma, looking at game theory. And really, their neurological equivalent is this marks cortical expansion in the species. Essentially, prefrontal cortex, that cortex that is in charge of limiting our immediate desires in preference of long-term, hopefully more rewarding things. What we're doing is being able to conceptualize, if we have iterative interactions over a long course of time, what is the best way of behaving? It's so interesting because essentially what that means is, you've heard me say before that we're living with hunter-gatherer biology, but we're living in a modern world. And there is no bad conditioning. There is only bad context for that conditioning, because we were built to adapt. We as a species were built to adapt to basically anything and everything, especially when we're very young. So our brains can get programmed to function under any environment, no matter how extreme. And what makes us healthy and competent, or some might call your sacred ground, is when our programming, our conditioning matches up with our environment really, really well. When that happens, we feel competent, and that changes the game, which is why that is the whole thing for Rethinking Broken. And that's why I find it really remarkable that this wound up here as well. That's my entire point in Rethinking Broken, is your childhood trauma didn't break you. It trained you. It trained you for a specific type of environment. And unfortunately, that type of environment is at least chronic stress filled. It could be worse. But when you put yourself into that type of environment again, with the understanding that it's temporary and that it's not eternal, so you don't have the overwhelming, this is going to be forever feeling and response that winds up shutting us down and making us not useful. When you get yourself into that, you feel so competent and incredible because you operate smooth as butter with no effort. It's great. For people like us who are chronic stress adapted, we're often amazing in a crisis. But what this means is that with our cortical expansion, we are living in a world in which our highest calling, the golden rule, is in direct competition with our biology, especially if your heritage, like mine, your cultural heritage, is Abrahamic or other honor-based religions. Because those religions predicated us to extreme violence. Honor-based religions are very violent. And it's because of that, if you steal one sheep, you can steal them all thing. And there is nobody else to help protect us, and there is nothing else for us to rely on. If a shepherd wakes up and his entire flock is gone, he's dead. You can't wake up and then your whole field is suddenly unplowed and unplanted. It could be burned. That's an issue, but that it's a lot harder to burn down a whole farm than it is to just kill one shepherd and take all of the sheep, or even just steal all the sheep in the middle of the night. Okay, so now with this iterative interactions thing, through the iterations, we learn all the rules of whatever game we're in, and those rules provide us the framework. And the reason games are so rewarding and game theory is so damn useful, even though it has such a seemingly silly name, the reason it's so useful is because, like I said, we're kind of always in competition because resources are finite to some degree. So with these neurological maybes to almosts, let's move back into this hero story again, because if you're looking at human behavior, there is very little that is as fixating and magnetic as intermittent reinforcement. So, and if you don't know what intermittent reinforcement is, it's essentially what social media now does, where just randomly you'll get a message about somebody liked your post, or somebody commented, or somebody posted this, and it's totally random. It doesn't really matter that it's here's a random person doing this at a random time. And because it happens randomly, it really spikes that dopamine circuit. But why? Well, here's why I think it's why. I think it's part of it is because it fits into our whole hero narrative. Because what the hero does is the hero moves into an unknown place and masters the unknown place and distributes the spoils. And the process is the hero's journey. going in, marking and going into the unknown, facing challenges, overcoming those challenges to essentially master something, and then come back to the place that you started, distributing all the spoils. Huzzah. Well, going into a place where you learn the game and you can bring back spoils, like a berry patch or something, that's wonderful. The only thing that could be better than that is going into a place that you haven't fully mapped out yet, that might actually have more of whatever it is that you want. More berries or more fruits or more animals that you can eat. So I think this is why intermittent reinforcement is so powerful, is because what it's doing is, through the reinforcement done by dopamine, we get really excited about things that seem a little bit random that we haven't quite figured out, because what it's spiking is this narrative, this ancient narrative where it's like, well, it's the opposite of the 2 birds in the hand is worth 1 in the bush. Well, neurologically, like 25 in a bush and 1 in the hand, like, if we can figure out a good way to catch all 25, then we should totally do that. And it seems like that is what is being leveraged through intermittent reinforcement, the dopaminergic intermittent reinforcement. And the way that this shows up in people is the intermittent reinforcement is maybe. That's when you introduce maybe into the neurology. And then there's something even more powerful than maybe. It's almost. Almost is incredibly powerful. Almost is what keeps people at the casinos. So they actually did some studies on this where almost is so powerful, we get a way, way bigger dopamine response out of getting 2 out of 3 on a slot machine or 4 out of 5 on a slot machine than we do out of just 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 5 or even 3 out of 5. You get way, way more dopamine response. And it seems like that is also part of this hero narrative to me. I mean, we all think of ourselves as the heroes in one way or another. And if you don't, and you're not doing main character shit, then you're probably not feeling great about yourself and your life, and you need to go do some more main character shit, because even on a neurological level, all of us truly, I believe, see ourselves as the hero, because we're having to balance our own struggles and our own fears as we challenge to go out and do something that we can then master and bring back to the community. And so what we're trying to get at through all of this is how to play the game. Whatever game it is. Most of the time we're playing multiple games with multiple people at a time. We're playing the husband or wife game and the parent game and the sibling game and the teacher game and the student game, and we're playing all of the games all the time. How do you convince someone who, say, is really, really good, like the privileged, like the extremely privileged? I hope I don't get this wrong. There was a study, this wasn't part of my notes. There was a study that was done on Canadian hockey kids. There were kids going out to play hockey in Canada because that's what they do. And they looked at why kids were good, why were some kids just so much better and got so much more ice time and all that than others. And the overwhelming factor was age. Because you can have like a almost full year gap between the oldest people on a team and the youngest people on a team. And when you are like prepubescent, that is a massive amount of brain space and body size that changes from being 9 months younger or being 9 months older than somebody else when you're playing a competitive physical sport. So there's factors like that. So say that you happened to be born in January and recruitment starts in February or whatever. So your birthday is right there and you get to be one of the biggest and one of the oldest. You are much more likely to be one of the best. Say that you are one of the best and you're excited. You want the ball or the puck. And you want the puck, you get the puck, and every time you get the puck, you're an asshole. You're just kind of a douchebag about it, and you don't pass it to anybody else, and you're the best player. And maybe you do score all the goals. Maybe you score more goals than anybody else. But when people are getting mad about it, and your mom sits you down and is like, yo, you can't do that. And kid says, well, why? Why can't I do that? I'm the best person on the team. I score all of the goals. I'm the reason we won this game, and I'm the reason we won this game. How do you actually logically explain to that child why they can't just be a dick when they are the best? Why can't you just be House and when you're a doctor? They can make a movie about it, but your career is probably going to be shit. I mean, even that, or I guess not movie, television show. And in the television show, his life was pretty much shit. And this is the reason. This is the reason. If you want to be able to sit down and explain this to your child, here is the reason. Because the games are iterative. That's the reason. That context of these games will be played over and over and over again for the rest of at least your childhood with pretty much the same group of kids. If you're an asshole the whole time, they will stop inviting you to play. And then you can't win. And being good is not useful anymore because you have no longer been invited, so you can't win. And if you can't win, and that's all you care about because you're good at it, you're screwed. That's why. The real why is built into the ecology in way of these games are iterative. If you're working with the same group of people over and over and over again, there's a certain way that you have to behave because there are social consequences. So that brings us to, it's not about how you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And that's why. The actual why is literally as simple as because there are multiple games. It's not that's how you're supposed to play, and it's not like because that's what nice people do. All of that's bullshit. All of that are just examples, like ways to communicate doing the same thing. They're just lies to tell you to be this way because that's what nice people do. No, what actually matters, like the reason, and I would love for it to be this is what nice people do, but I don't give a shit about niceness. I care about like the reality. And the reality is the fact that these games are iterative means that you will be interacting with these people for a long time to come. And if you have painted yourself as a jackass because you're a ball hog or a puck hog, then you're screwed. And that is why it's not about whether you win or lose. It's about how you play the game. Which, cool side note, there is an entire separate circuit in the brain for games, for play. Did you know that? There's an entire circuit in the brain that is unique to games, to playing games, which is really, really cool. And I think there's some neat stuff about the games in how the games are really important, I think, for our development because they allow us in a low-stakes way to experiment with limitations because a game is just a set of rules, essentially. And those rules are limitations. They say things must be played in this way, in this order. Those are the rules. Those are your limitations. So those are the limitations, and limitations actually spark creativity to the point where an arbitrary set of limitations will spark enough creativity that there is a subreddit with like hundreds of thousands of haikus about spam. Now, that seems really silly, and it is. And how does that prove my point? It proves my point because a haiku is a framework that you have to operate within in order to write a haiku. It's a piece of poetry that must have this certain layout of syllables. And that's the only limitation. It must have this certain layout of syllables. Now, anybody, anywhere could have made any form of poetry about spam, but they didn't. They didn't because there was no reason for that creativity. And they say, like, necessity is the mother of invention, and the necessity is brought on by a set of limitations. And so what games do for us is they allow us to operate within a set of rules, like playing basketball. And like you know the rules, you got to dribble, you got to pass to players and make shots through the hoop and all that. So within this very simple framework, there are an infinite number of ways to score a goal, as far as like who you can pass it to, and you pass it like a chest pass or bounce pass. Like you can play with all these variations. And so what you're really doing is, through play and through gameplay, you're working with your ability to work within a set paradigm and still explore unique possibilities. And this is important because, going back to the Abrahamic faiths, and Abraham, when Abraham was called on by God, he was already like 70 years old. He was from a wealthy family. He had everything he ever wanted, and he was totally satiated. He had the end of that cycle that says strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Well, he was at the top of the strong men had created good times, and he was born into those good times. So I guess really Abraham was one of those weak men, and God called on him to not be weak anymore. And what he did was call him essentially to adventure. He called him onto a hero's journey at like 70 years old, because he had all that he wanted. He had all of those, he had all of the self-indulgent stuff that can satiate a person. And what I'm getting at with all of this is that it's not about being satiated. It's about this balance. Like, the ultimate reward is really a balance of our own personal need for exploration and our need for the limitations. We need both. And that's laid out by this example here with Abraham. And it's present in the way that we play games like basketball, because you have to stay within the rules and you are part of a team, and that team is who wins altogether. But in order to mark yourself as like useful among the team, it helps to score goals. So you have to balance the need for the team scoring and the need for you scoring. And that teaches cooperation, which then fosters that trust, so we can have more of a buffer for those signal errors. When we have a buffer for those signal errors, we essentially have more trust. And when something goes wrong, we can essentially shrug it off and we can mark it off as a signal error. So the last thing I want to talk about with this is a incredible story that Dr. Sapolsky tells of some baboons that he worked with. He worked with baboons for like 33 years, and there was a troop that he studied in the Serengeti, where his lab was, that got a TB outbreak, or a tuberculosis outbreak. And TB in humans, you can live a little while with TB and then you die. Shitty way to go. Baboons, it's way worse, and you die like within a couple of weeks. And so TB obliterated part of the population. But how? That's what's so cool about this, is how. So it turns out that there was a dump where nearby, where a neighboring group of baboons got most of their sustenance from this dump that would dump out all of the leftover food from tourists. So, interesting side note, the baboon troop that got most of their food from there was not the troop that Sapolsky studied. That was the neighboring troop. He did go over there and study this neighboring troop who got all of this westernized food for a little while. And what he found is that they had less infant mortality, and they also had prediabetes and early signs of ischemic heart disease. And basically, they full on turned into the modern Western human being, which is exactly why he loved studying baboons. They're the perfect species to study. That's for like socially, if you're looking at psychosocial stress, there is no better species to look at for a human equivalent, because they get all of their actual needs, like as far as food and stuff, done in like the first 3 or 4 hours. Like that's the only amount of time they do all their socialization stuff up front. And then they do their work for their 3 or 4 hours for the day. And then they just have an infinite amount of time almost. They have tons of time, like 9 or 10 hours out of the day, to just sit around and cause psychosocial stress for each other, which that's exactly what modern human beings are doing now. So it's a great little analogy for him to study them. So that was the neighboring troop. His troop that he was really studying a lot more, what happened is there are many types of people in any given group of people. Same thing goes for baboons. You have high ranking and low ranking. You have aggressive and you have less aggressive. And turned out that there were a group of very aggressive, poorly socialized, not high ranking baboons that would go over and they would fight their way into this dump to try to get some of the food. And it's interesting that it was never the high-ranking ones because they're smarter than that. It was only hyper-aggressive males that went and did this. And as they did that, sure enough, they went over and that neighboring troop was obliterated by TV. And the baboons who went over there to get food also eventually got TB. And that meant that they died, and they died fairly quickly. So now you have way less male baboons in this group. And that changes the social dynamic of the group because baboons, they have all of these hours to sit around just fucking with each other and making each other miserable. So what happens when you have way less baboons and now there's a way higher ratio of females to males? Well, competition decreases. Douchebagism decreases. And over time, what that meant is, well, let's hold on for 1 second. One thing that you have to know about baboons for this to make sense is that somewhere around adolescence, the baboons leave the troop that they came from and they go to another troop and join into this other troop and get acclimatized to their culture. Or I guess indoctrinated. They get indoctrinated into the culture of whatever the other group is. But baboons are baboons, right? It's all the same. They're all the same culture. Wrong. They're not all the same. Just like we're not all the same. And that's what's so cool about this is in the same way that you can have a land mass that then isolates a population. Here was a unique cultural thing that there was an outbreak of TB in the neighboring colonies. And because of who went over there, the hyper-adrenergic douchebag, like, I about said gorillas, but they're baboons. All the douchebag, hyper-aggressive ones died, which meant the men who were left were properly socialized. They were of high rank, which meant they had less stress in their bodies, which meant they take stress out less on their other younger and lower ranking people. And so the entire culture got a chance to detoxify. And by detoxify, what actually happened is they produced less competition. There was less competition among them, which then meant that the aggressive baboons weren't beating up on the ladies anymore. And they were much more open. So as new baboons would leave their home troop and wander into this one, all baboons are baboons, so they'd come in thinking it's like any other baboon troop, but it's not. This is the hippie baboon troop. This is the hippie commune. And so they would come into this hippie commune baboon troop, and what would normally be a 70 or 80-day wait in which they were shunned and ignored turned into a 7-day wait on average. So 70 to 90 days is what it took for a female to eventually groom a new male that comes into, as a transfer, the baboon troop. Now, with this one baboon troop, instead of 70 or 80 days for the females to start grooming the new males, it was 7. And the reason that this was able to happen is because all the aggressive baboons have been kicked out. They aren't it's just gotten much more pleasant. And what's most interesting about this is when the TB break and all of that outbreak happened, Sapolsky had to leave, and then there were park regulation issues, and he wasn't able to come back for 10 years. 10 years later! 10 years later, he comes back to this baboon troop and their culture is identical. Every single male who was a part of the baboon troop immediately, actually, and the females, all of them were gone. All of the original baboons that lived through the TB outbreak were gone. And they still had this like approximate 7-day integration period for transfer baboons. They still had a culture that was less aggressive, or what we would talk about earlier as an honest culture. How does an honest culture get a toehold? How did these less aggressive cultures get a toehold? That's how. You want to know why, like, Zen Buddhism just took off more than anywhere else in the world from the Himalayas? Because of iterative interactions. They were isolated AF. And in one of the most insane climates in the world. They're at the foot of the freaking Himalayan mountains. They're in the Himalayan mountains, excuse me. They're in the Himalayan mountains where everything wants to kill them. So the only way that they can survive, like the bat species, is to be able to socially pool all of their resources. And that's exactly what they did, including culture. And their culture, they created Zen Buddhism, and our pastoralist pasts created a culture that turned into a monotheistic Abrahamic faith. But what's so incredible to me is that 10 years, baboons live a fairly long time. That 10 years is one generation, which means there can be a complete cultural shift in baboons, which are supposedly less aware and less prefrontal cortex and less everything than us. They had a complete cultural shift in one generation because the ecology changed and they had to adapt. And what they had to do to adapt, they then handed down through culture. I find that so incredibly interesting. I find it incredible. The ecology of morality, I think, is so interesting because essentially what it tells me at the end of the day is that the right thing to do is essentially determined by what was the right thing to do an hour before, a week before, a month before, and hundreds of years before. Last piece I'll throw on here, also not in my notes. I came across this last week. Turns out that there is a gene mutation that if you have 2 of these gene mutations, it's AA something something, then you were much more likely to have survived the plague back in the 1400s in the part of the world that got the plague. It's all white people, right? All these white people got the plague, the Black Death. And the people who survived, part of the reason that they survived, in theory, is that there happened to be a lot of this gene mutation, and people who had 2 copies of this same gene mutation survived. And that gene mutation, we now understand, has something to do with detection of inflammation and detection of foreign bodies and marking those things for the body to then deal with. That exact same mutation in modern days gives us Crohn's disease. The exact same. Like if you have that same and you have 2 of them, you get Crohn's disease. And what is that? What's happening? Your body is super, super adept at detecting and responding to inflammation anywhere inside of it, which is great if there's a plague. Less great if you're living in the modern world and you just want to eat something. It's the exact same gene mutation in a different context. One is adaptive, one is maladaptive. That is part and parcel for everything I've been saying and rethinking broken. And I think it's so important to recognize that this is happening on a narrative level through the human, through the hero lens. It's happening on a cultural narrative level. It's happening on a neurobiological level through the conditioning and the setup of these networks and the predisposition towards a response in a certain context. It's present over and over and over and over again, and they overlap beautifully. And so if anybody ever asks you, well, what's the right thing to do? The answer is always, it depends. Isn't that infuriating? It's infuriating. It depends. And what does it depend on? So many factors, we can barely shake a stick at it. But one thing that we know for sure is it depends on our ancestors. It depends on the culture that was handed down to them and the culture that was handed down to us. So there you have it. There you have the ecology of morality through the lens of game theory. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope that you will give it a like or leave a review. That helps the show out a lot. Thank you very much for spending your time with me today. I had a ball with this one. I hope that you enjoyed it or were at least entertained. Thank you again for spending your time with me. And as always, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.